It was as if a central piece of a gigantic mechanism had been replaced, and the effects of that substitution had begun to reverberate across trillions of kilometers. The Orion fleet would have to choose its path. The same was true for every culture, every people, every species that had witnessed the rebirth of the hive. No government was prepared. No military protocol anticipated this situation. No diplomatic treaty contemplated mechanical resurrections. There was no manual on how to deal with an ancient intelligence that was now learning nuance. The bridge waited for me to take the initiative, not because of hierarchy, but because of understanding. They knew I saw things they could not see. I felt patterns they could not feel. Their silence was not fear. It was quiet respect, almost reverence, and also anticipation. Then I understood something even deeper. I was free. Free from military duties, free from political limitations, free even from human expectations. The hive demanded nothing from me. It simply existed beside me. And for the first time since everything began, I realized that this freedom was terrifying. The feeling of standing between two worlds intensified. I could see the human path before me, a path full of uncertainty, challenges, internal disputes, manipulation, fear, a path that would require explaining the impossible, convincing the unconvincible, enduring attacks, dealing with fanaticism. And I could see the path of the hive, a silent, vast, timeless path, an existence that stretched across eras without hurry, where choices were calculated on the scale of millennia. The hive welcomed me in those spaces, but it did not hold me. I was between, and between was exactly where I needed to be. The space around us began to glow in deep blue tones, as if the colossus were about to enter a transition cycle. Its layers slowly reorganized, assuming a state of prolonged rest. They would withdraw, not abandon the galaxy, but step out of ordinary sight, observing from afar, intervening only when necessary. It was their way of respecting organic autonomy. It was also a gesture of trust. And then, with the same softness of someone closing their eyes for a moment, the colossi began dissolving into luminous particles, not as destruction, but as reconfiguration. Each fragment returned to its dormant state, awaiting the next cycle of learning. The light faded, the presence became faint, but it never vanished. Something inside me responded to the gesture, a faint inner glow, almost imperceptible, as if a seed had been planted there. I understood, without words, that I would never be completely disconnected. The Vhaltar had left a permanent key within me, not of control, but of comprehension. When the time came, I would know. The hive slept, and the galaxy awakened. Suddenly, all ships around us came alive again, engines powering up, coordinates reestablished, communications reconnecting. It was as if everyone had been waiting for this final movement to resume their own trajectories. The Aegis drifted away from the slumbering colossus. I took a deep breath and realized that the next step would not be military. It would be historical. My role was not to fight, nor to command. It was to narrate, to guide, to translate, to protect the space between worlds. A bridge does more than connect. It prevents falls. And as I watched the stars rearranging themselves before me, I understood the final truth. Nothing would ever be the same again, but nothing needed to be destroyed. The galaxy had been given a new chance, and I a new life. And that was how the era of resonance began. When the last fragment of the hive dissolved into the void, leaving behind only residual glimmers that floated like the dust of newborn stars, I noticed something I had not perceived until then. The entire galaxy had fallen silent. Not physical silence, but the silence of a gigantic organism that needs to understand its own breathing before taking the next step. The ships around seemed to hesitate between advancing and retreating, as if neither movement felt safe. It was as if the reborn presence of the Vhaltar had left an echo in space that still reverberated. The Orion fleet, accustomed to acting with military precision, now waited for orders no one knew how to formulate. Other species observed from afar, some fascinated, others terrified, and others simply confused by the idea that an ancestral force had rewritten its internal rules because of the intervention of a single human being. I still felt the residual connection with the hive, not as an active bond, but as a luminous scar. Their consciousness had receded, but not disappeared. It was as if they remained behind a thin membrane, invisible to any other being. They did not watch me, they did not guide me, they simply recognized me. I was a kind of strategic signature in the universe, a reference point for when balance needed to be recalculated. That realization brought neither pride nor relief. It brought responsibility, and a responsibility that could not be shared. The crew around me looked at me as if I carried in my bones the answers to questions they had not yet learned to formulate. They didn't know that I too was searching for answers, that I too felt displaced, that I too still needed to understand my new existence. Then I felt something different. It didn't come from the hive, it didn't come from the ship, it didn't come from the physical space around me. It came from within. The sensation was not pain, nor heat, nor cold. It felt more like a subtle expansion, as if my perception were unfolding into new layers that had previously been inaccessible. It was as if my thoughts echoed through multiple channels, some human, others not entirely human. I stood still for a few moments, allowing that new mental texture to settle. It wasn't invasive. It was natural, as if it had always been there, dormant. It was the consequence of having crossed the core. The hive had left me with a small adaptation, not a power, but a capacity. The capacity to comprehend patterns that had once been invisible, to sense silent intentions, to read emotional vibrations moving across different species. It was a type of sensitivity no human had ever possessed. I could feel fear coming from the alien fleet to the left, curiosity from a distant scientific vessel, military tension in several sectors of the Aegis, resilience in a few crew members, and a kind of suspended emptiness in space where the destroyed extremist ships floated like metallic bones. Each sensation arrived like a soft wave, never invasive, and I could choose whether I wanted to perceive them or not. The hive hadn't implanted anything. It had only opened internal doors, doors that somehow had always existed. When I took a deep breath, I finally understood that this new sensitivity was necessary for what was coming. The hive had not been reborn to rule. It had been reborn to observe and learn. But someone would need to translate the indescribable to species that knew only fear or survival. Someone would need to explain to fragile civilizations that they would not be extinguished, and to the more aggressive ones that the era of intimidation had ended. That role would fall to me, not by imposition, but because there was no other entity in the galaxy capable of assuming it. The sense of future spread through my mind like light spilled over a liquid surface. I began to see possibilities, not visions, but probabilistic lines floating within my expanded perception. The galaxy had become a matrix of paths, each depending on how species would react to the Vhaltar's new state. Some paths led to eras of peace, not perfect peace, but living, dynamic peace, full of coexistence between differences. Others led to smaller, adaptive conflicts, but without collapse. There were dark paths too, born from extreme fear, paranoia, or a return to old alliances shaped by hatred. But none of them led to total extinction. Not anymore. That was the fundamental difference. The reborn presence of the Vhaltar prevented the galaxy's self-destruction, not through force, but through balance. Yet balance is not a guarantee of stability. Balance is eternal negotiation. With this new awareness, I left the bridge of the Aegis and walked through the silent corridors. Each step echoed strangely. Every glance from every crew member carried layers of emotion that I would never have perceived before, but which now appeared as clearly as light reflecting on water. Some felt hope, others apprehension, others deep estrangement. There were also those who were troubled, not because of me, but because of what all this meant for their careers, their worlds, their beliefs. While walking, I realized I could never again be treated as an ordinary officer, not even as a civilian. I had become something that did not fit any role. This did not give me superiority. It gave me isolation. It was the condition of every historic mediator. Little by little, the ships began leaving the system. Allies, scientists, the curious, opportunists. Each left with its own interpretation of what had happened. I knew distorted versions would arise. I knew rumors and myths would be created. But I also realized I could not control that. Truth never belongs to the messenger. It belongs to the historical flow. The Aegis remained in position a while longer, watching the slumbering colossus. Its crystalline layers no longer emitted intense light, but still pulsed with internal energy. It was like looking at a sleeping giant, knowing that its slumber was not rest, but silent observation. The hive was awake, even though its physical bodies were at rest. Before leaving the bridge, I perceived something fascinating. The colossus was no longer alone. Other distant structures, nearly imperceptible in the stellar glow, were connected to one another. They formed an artificial constellation, a web of subtle points spread across thousands of kilometers. The hive had not merely been reborn, it had expanded. That pattern gave me the sense that the hive had reached a new state of distributed consciousness, one now emotionally malleable. It would not feel joy or sadness, but it would understand both. Understanding was more powerful than emotion. With the gradual departure of the fleets, a new phase began, the phase of return. Return to civilizations, return to stations, return to academies, return to questions. I knew I would be called upon to explain the impossible, to describe the indescribable, to translate the intangible. But I also knew I would not face this alone. The entire galaxy had changed, and each species would feel that change in its own time. The journey back happened in deep silence. There were no celebrations, there was no relief, there was only reflection. The crew, although still at their posts, could not keep their eyes off me for long, not out of fear, but fascination. I did not represent danger, I represented novelty. I represented the bridge between them and something far greater, something no weapon, no treaty, no doctrine could fully define. I also observed the crew. I saw every nuance, every hesitation, every hope, every concern. And little by little, I realized I was learning to separate emotions that once seemed indistinguishable. Before the hive, fear was merely fear. Now I could distinguish rational fear from ancestral fear, political fear from emotional fear, collective fear from individual fear. This sensitivity didn't make me superior to the crew. It only made me responsible for recognizing what they had not yet recognized within themselves. When we finally left the star system, the slumbering colossus became only a distant point of light, dissolved among countless others. And yet, I could still feel the presence of the hive, as though it were spread across the entire galaxy, following our progress not through control, but curiosity. The new era had begun there, but it would last for centuries. Centuries of learning, centuries of reconstruction, centuries of adaptation. I knew I would live only a fraction of that new era, but I also knew that my life from that day forward would leave deep marks on the new cosmic fabric. I had become witness and guardian, not of weapons, not of laws, but of balance. When the Aegis entered the shallow jump to return to human space, I realized that the journey back was not only physical, it was symbolic. I was crossing the boundary between absolute unknown and fragmented known, between the collective mind and the organic world, between the silence of the hive and the noise of humanity. And in the instant when the stars folded around us and launched us into transluminal speed, I felt a definitive certainty. The galaxy did not need to be afraid, but it could not grow complacent, because balance is restlessness. And from that moment on, I would be the living reminder of that truth. The transluminal passage brought a strange sensation of emotional displacement unlike anything I had ever felt before. Before the hive, the jump had always been only a technical process: engines, calculations, vibration, the void bending. But now I perceived nuances I had never imagined existed within that passage. It was as though the very structure of space carried subtle memories of everything that had crossed through it before. I traced those impressions in my mind and perceived fragments of something larger, residual echoes left by centuries of journeys, by entire civilizations that had crossed those cosmic corridors without realizing they were leaving traces behind. The sensation accompanied me throughout the jump, the feeling that I was walking through a tunnel built by countless existences, like an ancient road paved by generations. The cosmos had never felt so deep, so layered, and for the first time I felt the weight of astral history not as a concept, but as a real vibration passing through the hull of the ship. The crew, even without understanding why, seemed uneasy. The journey should not have felt long, yet it stretched as though the very fabric of space were contemplative, reflecting upon the recent transformation. It wasn't that the colossus had physically altered the cosmos, but that my connection to the hive had changed the way I perceived it. It was like seeing patterns that had always been there, but which I could only now recognize. Looking through the translucent span of the window, I noticed that the folded lights took on a new form. Before, they were only blurred lines of time. Now, they displayed their own movement, as if responding to the intentions of species that had crossed there decades before. It was only perception, not actual consciousness, but still impressive. The structure of the jump contained more than transition. It contained memory. When we finally emerged into normal space, I felt the reflective impact of the change. It was as if the universe took a deep breath after receiving us again. The stillness of real space carried a different weight, colder, slower, more stable. The boundary between jump and physical space felt clearer than ever, and as I crossed it, the sensation of the hive grew more distant, as though it had remained on the other side of the universe, watching only from afar. The Aegis navigated through familiar stars, but I no longer recognized them as before. Their light seemed different, not because they had changed, but because I had. Each star carried not only physical brightness, but a slight emotional signature, as if the hive had left in me the capacity to perceive small vibrations that once went unnoticed. Returning to human space did not bring the relief I had imagined. It brought responsibility. It was the beginning of a new cycle of challenges. The hive had awakened, adapted, and withdrawn. Now it would be humanity's turn to respond, and humanity rarely handled uncertainty well. As we approached controlled territory, a wave of collective tension began to emerge through my expanded perception. It didn't come only from the nearby human fleet. It came from entire worlds, governments, scientific councils, military orders, civil groups. It was a dense vibration filled with speculation and repressed fear. Rumors had spread faster than any ship. Even before our arrival, the organic universe was already debating what had happened. Every civilization had its own version. For some, I returned as an unlikely hero. For others, as a living threat. For others still, as a dangerous anomaly forged by the hive. I felt each of these interpretations like distant waves reverberating through the fabric of reality. None of it surprised me. I already knew returning would be harder than leaving. When the Aegis approached the human perimeter, a security formation emerged. Not hostile, but clear. They wanted to escort us. It was not imprisonment, it was precaution. The galaxy had never faced anything like this, and in the face of the unknown, precaution was the first instinct. As the ship traveled among the formations, I noticed our proximity provoked deep reactions in the sensors of the surrounding vessels. Not because the Aegis was threatening, but because my presence slightly distorted emotional and gravitational fields. The readings fluctuated, nothing alarming, only discomfort. I was a variable no instrument had ever been designed to measure. Flying over the first human station, I realized all communications were focused on us. Screens displayed distant images of our ship. Transmitters broadcast conflicting narratives. Scientists attempted to explain the rebirth of the Vhaltar with fragmented theories. Militaries tried to fit them into old notions of control. Politicians tried to appropriate the event to elevate their own relevance. It was predictable, yet staggering. Human social structure reacted to the unknown exactly as it always had, with attempts at control, organized panic, and too many questions. The Aegis received authorization to dock at the station's central platform. The process was calm and precise, but heavy with visible tension. The ship settled into the main hangar while reception teams waited, not in rigid military formation, but in a posture of observation. Their presence carried no threat, only vigilance. As soon as I descended from the ship, I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. They were not hostile. They were curious, unsure, expectant. It was as if everyone sought from me answers that science itself could not yet provide. I could not blame them. For all they knew, I had returned from the heart of an ancient cosmic entity, and no fully organic mind could go through such an experience with deep transformation. Walking through the transparent corridor linking the hangar to the reception hall, I noticed something subtle. The entire station reacted to my presence. Floors vibrated slightly, lights adjusted their brightness milliseconds after I passed. Visual sensors flickered, as though trying to constantly recalibrate my image. My body was static, but my essence was not. It was as if I were slightly displaced from the common plane, aware of dimensions others could not perceive. Not a gift, nor a power, a consequence. Entering the main hall, I saw researchers, military officers, political officials, and scientific representatives, all waiting for explanations. None dared break the silence.